You dress up for a Zoom call?
I mean, I'm trying to I'm wearing obviously like a baseball cap, but I'm trying to wear a button up. Yeah, like, especially if it's somebody who's like, Shasti is like the head of the Democratic Party. I know we're in Washington. This is kind of stupid.
No, it's nice.
Old habits die hard.
Yeah, it's admirable. I feel like you're trying to lift us all up. The tennis shoes and REI wearing public.
Just to be clear, I'm wearing a button up and for this interview and cutoff jeans. And like the dirtiest, rattiest pair of Adidas that I own. So
Is
below
this a
the
fit
table.
Check? Are we in the middle of a fit check?
One of those things the kids call.
Is that what it is?
Checks?
Am I using that correctly?
I think we need to. I think it's time for Sound Politics. Let's.
How's my fit?
Okay.
You're listening to Sound Politics, the show about this and the other Washington. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone.
President Trump is using the federal government to go after his enemies in ways we haven't seen in some cases since President Nixon, in some cases longer. In fact, the public way his Justice Department is conducting raids or announcing investigations on Republicans and Democrats who've opposed him in the past, it does not have a recent precedent in American history, Scott. I mean, it's that word unprecedented is, I think, an understatement.
But none of it is a surprise, right?
Yeah.
Like Trump promised retribution during his presidential campaign. And he's winked at, sometimes outright talked about suspending parts of the Constitution, right? Giving the federal government incredible power. His vice president has talked about defying the courts before the election even happened. And despite all of that, right, out in the open, voters looked at the Trump ticket last year and said, we'd rather have that than a Democrat.
Yeah, that's our team right there. And the opposition party where the Democrats find themselves is not a good vibes party right now. Recent polls show more people do identify as Democrats than Republicans. That is something you would expect because they just lost the presidential election. There's always a kind of pendulum swing. But when you look at actual registered Democratic voters, a recent analysis from the New York Times showed between 2020 and 2024, Democrats lost ground to Republicans in every single state that tracks voter registration by political party. Yeah. And this represents a 4.5 million voter hole that the Times said could take years for Democrats to climb out of.
Totally, yeah. And I think while voters who answer, pollster questions are not loving Trump's performance in office so far, the Democratic Party's net favorability is significantly worse. A Wall Street Journal survey recently found the lowest approval rating for Democrats in 35 years of polling.
So what's wrong with Democrats? And, what is it going to take to fix this? Since the 2024 election, one Washington Democrat has been saying, guys, look over here. Look up in the upper left corner of the state. Look at our state's Democratic wins for answers. She is Shasti Conrad, the Washington Democrats State Party Chair and Vice Chair of the Democratic National Committee. She was just in Minneapolis meeting with party leadership. Now she's in Virginia. Shasti, welcome. Thank you so much for being here on Soundside and Sound Politics.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate having me on, and what a setup to come and do to talk about.
Is that enough build-up for you?
What a setup!
Yeah, I mean, we do have to take a moment, I think, and think about what we've just witnessed, of course, in Minneapolis. You were there when this horrific shooting went on at the Catholic Church. Somebody killed 2 children and shot into a mass, injured 17 people. And I am struck right now, Shasti, by the split screen of watching different news outlets and the way that they're covering this. Fox News and right-wing social media, they're making this big deal out of the shooter's trans identity. Now, the mayor of Minneapolis has responded with a plea not to villainize trans people and to really keep the victims front and center of what's gone on here. I do think that this is an example, though, of how potent the anti-trans rhetoric can be on the right. When it comes to women's sports, the Kamala is for they, them. This was an issue that I don't think Democrats knew how to talk about in the last election. How are conversations going in the Democratic Party right now when it comes to messaging around trans identity, trans issues right now to the average voter?
Well, let me first say that, I mean, yesterday was incredibly jarring. We were about to gavel into our meeting, our general session of the Democratic National Committee. We had, 400 DNC members from across the country who had come in, and we had literally just heard from the mayor of Minneapolis. And as he was walking out the door, he stopped and told us that there was an active shooting that was happening just 10 minutes from where we all were gathered. And he had just given us a, sort of rousing, story of like all of the amazing work that's been happening in Minneapolis, and, that his particular passion is around housing and, sort of bringing down the cost of living for regular people. And, these are things that Democrats can win on, and he's been winning on it. And then to turn around and have this horrific thing that is this reminder of, we've tried so hard, particularly in Washington state, to really combat and get guns off the streets and combat gun violence. And to have this happen right here was horrifying. And, I think the fact too that it's children that were killed, and that and I appreciated the mayor saying, enough with the thoughts and prayers. These people were literally praying at their Catholic school and starting school with, so like prayers didn't protect them. And, I think Democrats have long, promoted policies of trying to get guns, make it harder for people to be able to purchase them, because the shooter was able to buy a gun very recently and easily. And, I think Republicans have to join us in this fight to recognize that anytime anyone's being killed, but particularly kids like this, doesn't matter who, it matters that we've got to get these weapons off the streets. So let me start there. So on the discussion around, trans issues and trans identity, I think that, I will never say that that we should abandon people that are, in marginalized populations and communities. I believe at the very basic level of why I've chosen the Democratic Party to be a part of is because we stand up for everyone's human rights. We stand up for civil rights. We stand up for people who, you want to talk about religion, it's like, the first go last, the last go first. Like the basic tenets of being a good human is that we care for those in need. And, because of the policies that have been pushed mostly by Republicans, but that have been carried out through our society, there have been targets on, on trans people and people in the LGBTQI community. So I believe we should never abandon them, and we should always stand up for folks and anybody who is being targeted in those ways. But I also think that we have to remind people that like that's like I think 1-2% of the overall US population. And the things that are impacting everybody, gun violence, things that are impacting everybody, affordability, what's impacting everybody, the fact that their friends and neighbors are losing their jobs because of, the federal cuts that are happening under the Trump administration. Those are the things that are making a difference in people's lives. And, while we continue to, want to try to talk about anything and everything else, we have to get back to the basics of, Democrats have to have a strong, cohesive message that when we are in office, things get better, and that we actually care about what's happening in real people's lives. And, that's the truth, but we have to build that trust. And as you all laid out earlier, we haven't done a good job. I think there's room for improvement, that people, for whatever reason, even though we were having, some of the best economic years under the Biden administration, it wasn't resonating. People didn't feel that. And that is both messaging, but that's also we weren't showing up in the ways in which we needed to be able to actually, people see it and feel it in a very real way. And we have to be honest about that.
We threw a lot at you with that intro and those questions right away about a lot of hot button issues. So I do want to go back briefly to just what we talked about what you've been saying, that like the rest of the party and the rest of the nation could learn something from Washington Democrats. I know I'm kind of paraphrasing there with what you've said. But yeah, what do you think Democrats in Washington state are doing right, and what have you argued other Democrats could learn? Well, how are you sort of spreading the good word of Washington Democratic Party?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about this before, which is, Washington State was the only state in the country that when you include our statewide elections that we actually went more blue. And the thing that is always so, incredible to me is that the places where we grew our margins were actually in rural districts. It was out on the peninsula. It was in like Ferry County. It was in Walla Walla. It was in places that are not what you see on the TV as these like sort of blue urban oases where it's super easy. No, these are in places where we have had to do the organizing work of actually talking to people, building with community to show that we're showing up and that that people's lives can actually change and it can be made different by the fact that they have different types of representatives like a Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez in CD3 that, you can have all kinds of opinions, but she is showing up and hosting town halls across her district, even when she's getting shouted down. Her predecessor, wasn't doing that. And in, CD4, Dan Newhouse hadn't hosted a town hall for, I think, since early 2023.
CD4 is
And,
Yakima area.
yeah,
Sorry,
and
just want to, for
exactly.
people, for the uninitiated.
Sorry. Yes, Yakima area. Yes, exactly. Central Washington. So, I do think that it's important to sort of demonstrate that it's like that real, like very basic on the ground organizing really does make a difference. Talking to your neighbors and getting to know people and being able to say, like, this is why I care. All of the data says that the best way to encourage people to participate is by saying why you care, like why this matters to you. I think the other big piece of it is building trust. We have in Washington State the longest running tenure of Democratic governors in the entire country and in history. And so, I think what we have been able to show is that, look, there's all kinds of things you can gripe about and be frustrated about, but overall, I'd much rather be in our Washington than in Washington, D.C. right now, that we have built in a way that, growing our margins in the state legislature means that we're able to get things done like the Climate Commitment Act, like long-term cares. We are addressing the issues that people say they've wanted dealt with for a long time because we have leadership that is willing to move the needle and not take us backwards. And so that's different. And we looked at when we were sort of putting together our white paper to understand why we did better than everybody else in the country. We looked at Oregon. It wasn't demographics. It wasn't that it was because we have more people that are college educated. It was all of these different factors that you would want to sort of say, well, this must be it. No, it's because of the types of people that we're running, which is pragmatic progressives who are moving the needle forward, but they're doing it in a way that's not burn it down, that's not trying to, move it too quickly, but that are trying to just show that like good governance makes a difference and that that our policies are popular. People want to be paid more at their jobs. They want to be able to take family medical leave when they have a baby. They want to be able to take care of their aging parents. They want to be able to have good public school systems. These are the basics, and I do think we have been delivering here in this Washington. And that's why I believe I've been trying to say we're a model out here in our Washington to take that to the national level as well.
So I'm hearing you say it's like candidate recruitment. It's about policies that actually affect people's bottom lines. One thing that has been brought up and is kind of in the milieu is, did Democrats seem to disrespect voters or to be elitist towards voters? And something that came across my feed that I think has been shared a lot of times by now is sort of the tone conversation that Marc Maron had in his last stand-up special. You're probably too busy to have watched the special, but there was one part that stood out, and here I'm just going to play a clip of what Maron here said.
Progressives have really got to figure out how to deal with this buzzkill problem. I know these are important issues, but you do realize we annoyed the average American into fascism. You do realize that.
Marc Maron, of course, with a career where he did Air America and has a progressive history of broadcasting. And he said on Pod Save America on Sunday that, that's a joke, obviously, but it resonates because I've also lately been exploring the difference between anger and hate. Anger as a tone in all of its spectrum is not always entertaining. And, self-righteous anger is the most intolerable anger. And even if you believe what the person is saying, you want them to shut the F up. And so basically, the message is one thing, but the way you deliver the message is another. I mean, can you reflect on that? What do you think about what Marin is saying there?
I mean, he does it in the, he says it in a funny way that actually, cuts through, which I think is exactly what we are learning, and that we've got to be messaging in exactly as he just did, which is just say it. And, I think that it's true. In trying to say that we were for, this group and that group and that group, we ended up alienating everybody because everybody felt like we were not for them. Like, I mean, I always hate to give Republicans credit, but they're like, Kamala is not for us, she's for they, them. I mean, it was very effective. That type of very cut through type of line really resonated with a lot of people, and it played on people's resentment, right? We have to admit that in the United States of America, there is a long history of racial resentment. And, as we were coming into, 2020 and, the sort of aftermath of George Floyd, there was like a moment as we were all in the pandemic where it started to feel like this kind of like, hey, maybe we're going to sort of think about our long history. We're going to grapple with it, and we're going to actually create space and bring more people to the table. And then we tried to do that for like 6 months, and people in power that now, they see themselves in Donald Trump, we're like, no, 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 I don't want to do that. That's not what I want. No, I don't like this. And so I think we as Democrats do have to like bring it back to that we are for the people. We are for the people. We're for you. We are for you. Our policies are about trying to make your life better. That is true. And, and we also have to, I say it sounds silly, but it's like we have to bring the party back into this work. Like we have to make this, I talk about joy and rest as being as important in fighting fascism as anything else. If this isn't fun, if this isn't like, if we are not reminded about why we are alive, why we want to be in community, why we care about the people that we love, if we're not talking about those things, then yeah, everyone's going to tune out because who wants to be told over and over again that like they're bad and we're like slightly better?
And that's, I think, the thing, like the talking down to voters that I think Marin is hitting on there. So you think that there was an issue with that. And I mean, when you look at like the diploma divide and how, the biggest indicator these days of whether you're a Democratic voter or not is whether you have a college diploma, is there a risk that is like a permanent fixture, that it's sort of a snooty, intellectual, like talking down vibe that the Democrats can't shake?
I mean, I think, that stat and that we lost with working class people and that, working folks feel like, that the Democratic Party isn't their party anymore. I mean, that for me has been one of the most disturbing sort of hot takes from 2024 that shows up, which is, I think that our most important wins of the last decade have been like labor wins, and you did have President Biden who was, out on the, strikers lines and like was, really working directly with so many of our unions. And, one of the sort of canaries in the coal mine for me was about a year ago, or I guess it was like early 2024. We were hearing that even though leadership at the unions they were still with us, they were having a lot of issues with their members, that their members were really feeling like the Democratic Party didn't hear them, didn't care about them. And there was a lot of racial resentment that was occurring also with these folks. And I think we were too quick to write that off of like, oh, it'll settle down because they'll see Trump as awful and that's enough. And it's not. I mean, look, I think the part of this is that we have to be honest. And when you lose a big election like we did last year, clearly we did things wrong. And I think a lot of that was that we just didn't connect with real people in a way that we should have been. And we let the other side make inroads because they were going to where people were actually getting their information and they were making them feel like they were a part of what they were building. And Trump did tap into that rage, which interested in the sort of anger versus hate comment that you made, because I do think that is also very important to sort of parse out. And they were able to tap into that in a way that I think we missed it. We didn't understand how deep that went.
When I'm covering local politics, obviously around here, a lot of Democrats are the ones running City Hall and things like that. And one complaint I hear a lot is that instead of taking, bold action, people sometimes feel like they just put together committees and study the problem with task forces. And I'm thinking about that right now because of a very not local thing, and something that happened that at the DNC meeting in Minneapolis this week. You co-sponsored a resolution that called for unconditional release of hostages in Gaza, Israeli hostages in Gaza, and unrestricted delivery of food, water, and medicine to Gazan people who are starving. That was introduced by DNC Chair Ken Martin, and it passed, I think, unanimously. But then the chair, again, Ken Martin, he withdrew it and said he plans to appoint a committee or a task force comprised of, quote, stakeholders on all sides of this to discuss the matter and bring solutions back to the party. And again, this is like a resolution, so it's not binding. It's just urging the Democrat elected officials to push for these things. So I think with a question like this, where polling is pretty clear, like support for Israel's war has been plunging, especially among Democrats. As a co-sponsor, how did you feel about more discussion at this moment that is pretty dire for Palestinians?
Well, I signed on to that resolution because it was important to me that we did have the discussion. Like, I felt that it was really, I've heard it all over that we Democrats have not stood up enough for what is happening. It hasn't stood up against what is happening in Gaza enough, hasn't called it out. And, I'm since October 7th, 2023, as a state party chair, have, played the role of really trying to recognize that the pain and the trauma that is happening in the Jewish community and also in the Muslim community, progressive community, Palestinian community, and tried to walk the line of, we've got to create space for acknowledging the what is happening, that it's real, and that people have a right. You want to talk about anger and rage, like have a right to feel rage about what is happening in Gaza. Babies are dying. It is starvation that is being done as a weapon of war.
Yeah.
So I signed on to that because I felt it was very important that we addressed it and that we talked about it. And that conversation did happen in the resolutions committee, which I am not a part of that committee. My understanding is that, that the chair saw that there was still a lot of raw emotion around this issue and didn't want to adopt a policy, a resolution that didn't meet the moment, and that there was more discussion that needed to take place, and that there was more that we needed to hear from community more. And that was why he made the decision to pull the resolution, to withdraw it, and therefore to then he mentioned this task force that he was going to put together. And because of the shooting that happened in Minneapolis yesterday, we were not able to have discussion about any of our business that we were going to take up yesterday. So we didn't have space to be able to have that discussion. But I do think that, I had heard that there were thousands of messages that had come in to the resolutions committee, on this subject, which shows the passion and the fervor with which people want to talk about this and are rightfully upset about what is happening. And how could you not be?
I realized we started this episode talking about Trump. For the final question, I want to come full circle. Some people talk about, I mean, I wonder if you worry that the party is too centered around Trump. He hasn't come up, I notice, much in this conversation other than us bringing him up. People talk about, well, the Democrats are the anti-Trump party, but do people know what else the party currently stands for at this moment? And being the anti-Trump party seems to play just fine here in Washington State. Washington State voters do not seem very, enamored with Trump. Republicans have done very poorly since he was first elected. It doesn't seem to be working so well for the rest of the country. Can you talk about how the party as a whole is grappling with this existential question?
Well, let me first say, I think, West is best. I love our West Coast. And I think that, out here in the West, we can see a dictator and we can see a despot, and we know that. And so we're better able to reject it. Although I will say that, when we've run sort of data and research into the Republican Party in Washington State, their views match Alabama Republicans too. So there's certainly, Republicans in Washington State who, including their chair, Jim Walsh, who love Trump, loves what he's doing, and that's what they're running on. So it's not that it doesn't exist, that there aren't people who believe that Trump is on the right track in Washington. It's just that they lose. Those folks are losing pretty overwhelmingly out here on the West Coast. What I will say is that we know as a Democratic Party is that what we didn't do well enough in 2024 is that we didn't talk enough about what we are going to do when we are in power and what we are going to get done. And I think I have really appreciated hearing folks like Governor Tim Walz say, we need to say and we need to be ready to enact that the minute we get power back, there's no waffling on, like whether it should be, 10% more dollars towards Medicare or this or that. No, we're talking about universal health care. That is what we are getting done. We are getting done policies that are going to be sweeping and actually make this like real difference in people's lives. Things like we have in Washington State, a much higher minimum wage than we have at the federal level, much greater access to paid family medical leave, things like that we have in our Washington State that everybody in this country should have. We have to be able to be very clear about what is going to happen when we take back the House and when we take back the White House. And Democrats have to be bold in that. And it can't just be about Trump. It's not just fighting it's fighting for. Who are we fighting for? It's like those working people that are, have union labor jobs and are, have seen their rights be rolled back. It is for, people like it's for kids who should be able to go to school and not be afraid they're going to get shot, right? Like that's who we are fighting for. It's our parents making sure that they have care through the end of their lives and that we are able to take the time off to care for them, which is something that I know deeply as someone who lost her mother and was a caregiver for my mother. Like that's who we are fighting for. And if we just talk about Trump, we are missing the fact that it is bigger than Trump. Like this cancer that is in the Republican Party, that is this mindset of only the few like billionaires and technocrats are the ones who should have all the power, who are smarter than everybody else and who should run everything, then we are going to continue to lose. And we have to be ready to take that on, not just Trump, and then be ready to make a difference when we get power back.
Shasti Conrad chairs the state Democratic Party and is DNC vice chair. Shasti, thank you so much for joining us and digging deep and also reaching very far and wide through all of these different topics.
Thanks for having me.
And Scott, before we go, this conversation with Shasti aired on the radio before we actually posted it as a podcast, and we asked for people's comments. I was really struck by a couple of them, and this first one's from Julie. Julie says, thanks for the discussion. When Shasti was defending the tabling of their amendment on what's happening in Palestine, I couldn't help but think, if Democrats continue to think that they can make everybody happy, they will never get something done. That's Julie's comment on kind of the idea that, more conversation, more trying to like pull in all the different contentious threads within the party, it's going to grind things to a halt. Yeah,
it's interesting. We got another comment from someone who kind of felt, someone named Sean, who kind of feels like the party in this state and even just on the West Coast has veered into the fringe socialist, Marxist-influenced elements. Sean said, the majority of the country is not buying what Washington, Oregon, and California are selling. People care about issues, but not to the activist level. People are over it.
That's interesting because Julie thinks Democrats are trying to make everybody happy, and Sean thinks they're just trying to make socialists happy.
It's we dove feet first into probably the biggest, most raging conversation, that is happening certainly on the West Coast, but just like in politics in general right now. And I'm glad that people gave their feedback. Remember that you can hear this show every week on Thursday. It airs on KUOW. If you're a radio person,
if you like the old-fashioned radio waves, I'm happy with that episode of Sound Politics. So thank you, everybody who listened. My name's Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone.
Our show is edited by Kat Smith and produced this week by Sarah Leibovitz. Get well soon, Hans. We have a great donor to thank, Matthew. You are the wind beneath our wings, Matthew.
That's
we
right.
appreciate you. Join Matthew at kuow.org/politics.
Matthew, we can't thank you enough. You're helping us keep the lights on. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.